The first thing I noticed when the restaurant door opened was not the pregnant woman standing nervously beside my friends. It was the way everyone at the table was trying not to laugh. They had planned it carefully, from the fake excitement in their faces to the empty chair waiting beside me, and for a few seconds I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong restaurant. Then I saw her hand resting protectively over her stomach, her other hand clutching a worn handbag, and I understood exactly what they had done. They had invited a heavily pregnant stranger to my double date as a joke, expecting me to become embarrassed, angry, or walk out. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 years learning what it meant to be abandoned when you needed someone most. And when I looked into that woman's frightened eyes, I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even pretend the joke was funny. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances still matter in a world that sometimes feels cruel, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue sharing stories that remind us what really matters. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was 32 weeks pregnant. I learned that later, but in those first few moments, all I knew was that she looked exhausted. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose knot, several strands falling around her pale face, and her simple blue dress looked like something she had chosen because comfort mattered more than appearance. She kept glancing between me and the people around the table, clearly realizing that she had been brought into something she didn't understand. My friends, Everett and Mallory, had been laughing quietly since I entered. Across from them sat their dates, who looked uncomfortable but amused enough to stay silent. Everett had told me earlier that morning that this would be a relaxed double date, something casual to help me get back into the dating world after years of avoiding relationships. Instead, they had apparently decided that my life was entertaining enough to become the afternoon's joke. I had known Everett since college, and although we had grown apart over the years, I had always believed there was something genuine underneath his sarcasm. Mallory was his fiancée, energetic and clever, the kind of person who could turn almost any situation into a story. They knew I had been through a difficult breakup. They also knew why I had become cautious around relationships. 5 years earlier, my fiancée, Elise, had left me 3 weeks before our wedding after telling me she had fallen in love with someone else. What made it worse was that she took the money we had saved for our future home and disappeared without giving me any explanation beyond saying that she wanted a different life. I had spent years rebuilding myself after that betrayal, and I had finally reached a point where I could wake up without wondering what I had done wrong. But there was another reason I hated abandonment. My mother had raised me alone after my father left when I was 9. She worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted, and still somehow found the strength to make me feel safe. When she became sick years later, I was the one who cared for her. I watched the strongest person I had ever known slowly become weaker, and before she died, she made me promise that I would never become the kind of person who looked away when someone was hurting simply because helping was inconvenient. Her final lesson had nothing to do with money, success, or pride. It was about showing up. So when I looked at Clara sitting alone at the edge of the table, I didn't see the punchline my friends had prepared. I saw someone who needed another human being to treat her like she mattered. I pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. The laughter stopped. Everett's smile disappeared first. Mallory stared at me as if I had broken an unwritten rule. I didn't say anything. I simply picked up the menu and placed it in front of Clara. She looked at me with confusion, and then her eyes filled with tears. She tried to hide them by looking down. The waitress arrived a few moments later, and while everyone else ordered expensive meals, Clara quietly asked for a glass of water. I noticed her hands trembling. I ordered lunch for both of us, choosing something simple and nutritious, and asked the waitress if she could bring some extra water. No dramatic speech followed. No angry confrontation. I didn't need one. The room had already become uncomfortable enough. After a few minutes, Clara finally admitted that she hadn't known it was a joke. Mallory had contacted her through a local community group, claiming she needed someone to attend a casual lunch because her friend had cancelled. Clara had agreed because she had been struggling financially and had recently moved into the area. She thought she was doing someone a favor in exchange for a free meal. She had never imagined that 4 strangers would be waiting to laugh at her. That confession changed the entire atmosphere. I felt anger rising inside me, but I remembered my mother's promise. Anger could tell me that something was wrong, but it didn't have to decide what I did next. I looked at Everett and Mallory and asked them to explain themselves. They admitted that they thought it would be funny because I was always serious about dating and had rejected every blind date they had arranged. They said they wanted to see my reaction when I discovered that my supposed date was a very pregnant woman. They had assumed I would be horrified and that everyone would laugh together afterward. Nobody laughed now. Clara slowly stood up, apologizing even though she had done absolutely nothing wrong. She said she didn't want to cause trouble and started toward the door. I stood immediately and followed her outside into the bright afternoon. She stopped near the sidewalk and wiped her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she had been embarrassed. She was crying because she had become accustomed to people treating her circumstances as something shameful. That realization stayed with me. I offered to drive her home. She hesitated, but eventually accepted. During the short drive, she told me pieces of her story. Her baby's father had left shortly after learning she was pregnant. At first he promised he would be involved, but eventually he stopped answering her calls. Clara had sold most of her belongings to cover medical bills and rent. She had moved closer to a hospital where she could receive affordable prenatal care. She was working remotely whenever her body allowed it, but there were days when exhaustion made even simple tasks feel impossible. She wasn't looking for pity. That was what struck me most. She was simply trying to survive. When we reached her small apartment building, I carried her handbag upstairs. The place was modest but clean. A crib stood beside the living room wall, still partly wrapped in plastic because she hadn't been able to afford a mattress yet. There were folded baby clothes stacked on a chair, each piece carefully washed and arranged. On the kitchen counter sat a small envelope containing what appeared to be her remaining cash. I suddenly understood why she had accepted the invitation. A free meal wasn't just a free meal to someone counting every dollar. It was one less expense. I offered to help with the crib, but she refused at first. Pride made her uncomfortable with accepting anything. Eventually, she allowed me to tighten the loose screws and adjust the frame. While I worked, she told me about the baby she had already named Grace. She said she chose the name because she wanted her daughter to grow up believing that kindness existed even when life proved otherwise. I looked at the unfinished crib and felt something inside me break open. For years, I had believed my mother's death was the saddest thing I would ever experience. Then Elise left, and I thought betrayal was the cruelest thing. But standing in Clara's apartment, I realized there was another kind of pain, watching someone struggle while everyone else decided their struggle was entertainment. I couldn't change what had happened to her. But I could decide what happened next. The following afternoon, I returned with the supplies she needed to finish the crib. I also brought groceries. She tried to refuse, but I told her that accepting help didn't make her weak. It simply meant she was human. That sentence seemed to stay with her. Over the next several weeks, our friendship grew slowly. There was nothing romantic about it at first. I didn't see Clara as someone I needed to rescue, and she never treated me like someone responsible for saving her. We simply became two people who understood loneliness. Meanwhile, Everett and Mallory disappeared from my life. At first, I was relieved. Then, one afternoon, Everett showed up at my apartment. He looked different. The confidence was gone from his face. He admitted that after I left the restaurant, Mallory had tried to convince him they had done nothing wrong. But when they returned to the restaurant several days later, the waitress told them Clara had been struggling to pay for her prenatal appointments and had left behind a note thanking the restaurant staff for treating her kindly. Everett said that was when the joke stopped being funny. He told me he had spent years believing humiliation was harmless if everyone eventually laughed. He finally understood that the person being humiliated might carry that moment much longer than the people who created it. He apologized. Not the casual apology people give when they want the uncomfortable conversation to end. A real apology. He admitted that he had used my pain as entertainment and Clara's circumstances as a prop. He said he had become someone he didn't recognize. I didn't forgive him immediately. Forgiveness, I had learned, wasn't the same thing as pretending nothing happened. But I told him I was willing to believe people could change if they were willing to prove it. Months passed. Clara's baby shower was small, held during a sunny Saturday afternoon in a community center. There were inexpensive decorations, homemade food, and a handful of people Clara had met through neighbors and co-workers. Everett came too, carrying a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a new crib mattress. He had bought it himself. Mallory stayed away at first, ashamed to face Clara, but eventually she sent a letter. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply admitted that she had been cruel and careless, and she hoped that one day Clara would be able to think about that restaurant without remembering the humiliation. Clara cried when she read it. Then she smiled. She said people didn't always deserve immediate forgiveness, but sometimes they deserved the opportunity to become better than the person they had been. That sentence changed me. A few weeks later, Grace was born. She was healthy, tiny, and loud, with a shock of pale hair and tiny fingers that wrapped around mine when I visited Clara at the hospital during the afternoon. I remember staring at that little hand and thinking about my mother. She had told me never to look away from someone who was hurting. I finally understood why. Sometimes kindness doesn't change the whole world. Sometimes it changes one person's day. Sometimes it changes one person's life. And sometimes, without us realizing it, that single act of kindness changes our own life too. Clara eventually found a better apartment through a housing assistance program. She returned to work gradually and became stronger than she had ever imagined possible. I continued visiting, sometimes helping with groceries, sometimes simply sitting with her while Grace slept. Over time, Clara became one of the most important people in my life. Years later, when Grace started preschool, she called me Uncle Rowan. That single word meant more to me than any relationship I had ever lost. Everett and I eventually repaired our friendship too, although it was different. Deeper. More honest. He stopped making cruel jokes at other people's expense. Mallory began volunteering at the community center where Clara had once sought help. She never tried to erase what she had done. Instead, she spent years making sure other people didn't experience the same kind of humiliation. As for me, I finally understood something I had been avoiding for years. My reaction that day wasn't really about Clara. It was about the person I wanted to become. I could have laughed. I could have walked away. I could have embarrassed the people who embarrassed her. I could have demanded revenge and felt justified. Instead, I chose kindness. Not because kindness was easy. Because my mother had taught me that the hardest moments reveal who we truly are. That ridiculous double date was supposed to be a joke. Instead, it became the moment that reminded all of us that every person sitting across from us is carrying a story we may know nothing about. The pregnant woman they thought would be an easy punchline became a mother who taught me courage. The friends who humiliated her became people forced to confront their own cruelty. And I became someone who finally stopped allowing the pain of my past to decide the shape of my future. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you leave, tell our community this: have you ever chosen kindness when anger would have been easier, and did that choice change you? Your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Because sometimes the greatest reaction isn't anger. Sometimes it is compassion. Sometimes the person everyone expects you to reject becomes the person who reminds you how to love life again. And sometimes a cruel joke, meant to humiliate someone, becomes the unexpected beginning of forgiveness, friendship, and a second chance. That afternoon, they thought they were choosing a pregnant woman for my double date as a joke. They had no idea they were choosing the person who would teach me that the most powerful response to cruelty is not revenge. It is becoming kinder than the people who hurt you. 3 years passed after Grace was born, and by then the strange afternoon that had brought Clara and me together had become one of those memories we rarely discussed because neither of us needed to. Life had moved forward in a way neither of us could have predicted. Clara had rebuilt her career, found a stable home, and become the kind of mother who could turn an ordinary grocery trip into an adventure for her daughter. Grace had grown into a bright little girl who asked endless questions, collected leaves from every park she visited, and believed that every person she met had a story worth hearing. I had also changed. I no longer measured my life by the people who had left it. I had stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped wondering whether the next person I trusted would disappear, and slowly learned that opening your heart again did not mean forgetting the wounds that came before. One warm afternoon, Clara invited me to Grace's 4th birthday celebration at the community park. Children ran between picnic tables while parents carried plates of food, and sunlight filtered through the trees. I arrived carrying a small wrapped present, expecting the usual chaos of balloons and children chasing each other across the grass. Instead, I noticed Clara standing near the edge of the playground with a worried expression. She was holding a folded envelope in her hand and staring at it as if the paper contained something capable of changing her entire life. She finally showed it to me. It was a letter from Grace's biological father. His name was Adrian Cole, and according to the letter, he had recently returned to the area after years away. He claimed he had changed. He said he wanted to meet his daughter and believed he deserved a chance to become part of her life. He included photographs, an address, and a long explanation about the years he had spent struggling with his own mistakes. Clara had never told Grace much about her father because she wanted her daughter to grow up without carrying resentment that wasn't hers to carry. But now the past had come knocking. Clara was terrified. Not because she hated Adrian. She was terrified because she had spent years protecting Grace from disappointment, and she knew that if Adrian entered her daughter's life, he could either become someone wonderful or disappear again and leave a wound much deeper than before. I told Clara that she didn't have to decide that afternoon. She didn't have to answer the letter immediately. She didn't owe Adrian access simply because he had finally become curious about the child he had abandoned. But I also reminded her that fear could not be allowed to control every decision forever. She folded the letter carefully and put it back into the envelope. Then Grace ran toward us carrying a small yellow flower. She had no idea that the adults around her were standing at the edge of a decision that could change her childhood. For several weeks, Clara considered what to do. She contacted a counselor, spoke with people she trusted, and eventually agreed to a carefully arranged meeting between Adrian and Grace in a public place during the daytime. I wasn't there for the first meeting. Clara wanted to handle it herself. When she returned home that afternoon, she called me. She said Adrian had cried when he saw Grace. But tears were not enough. He had apologized. He had admitted that fear had made him run, that shame had kept him away, and that every year he waited made returning more difficult. He didn't ask Clara to forgive him. He didn't demand that Grace call him Dad. He simply asked for the chance to prove that he could be reliable. Clara remained cautious. Weeks became months, and Adrian kept showing up. He attended Grace's school events. He remembered her favorite stories. He learned how she liked her sandwiches cut. He never made promises he couldn't keep. Slowly, Grace began to understand that the man she once knew only as a name in old photographs was becoming part of her life. But then something happened that none of us expected. Adrian became sick. The diagnosis was serious enough that he had to stop working for a while. Suddenly, the man who had spent years trying to prove he was dependable found himself dependent on others. He was ashamed. He wanted to disappear again, believing that Grace deserved a father who wasn't broken. When Clara told me, I remembered my own mother. I remembered how she had looked when she was sick, how fiercely she had fought to maintain her independence, and how much she hated being treated as a burden. I told Clara that Adrian's illness didn't erase his past, but neither did his past erase the progress he had made. She agreed. She brought Grace to visit him. The first visit lasted only 20 minutes. Grace brought him one of her drawings. It was a picture of 3 people standing beneath a giant yellow sun. The figures were crude, colorful shapes, but Adrian stared at it for a long time. Then he cried. Not because he was sick. Because for the first time, he understood that he had been given something he never expected to receive again. A chance. Over the next year, his health gradually improved. He couldn't return to his old career, but he found work he could manage and became involved in Grace's life in a way that was consistent and humble. He never tried to replace me. He never treated me like an enemy. In fact, one afternoon, while we were watching Grace play on the swings, he thanked me for being there when he wasn't. I told him he didn't owe me gratitude. He disagreed. He said that sometimes the people who arrive during our worst moments become part of the reason we survive them. That sentence stayed with me. Because it made me realize that Clara hadn't been the only person I had helped. She had helped me too. Then came the most unexpected moment of all. Clara asked me to sit down with her one afternoon. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept looking at me with the same nervous expression I had seen on her face years earlier at that restaurant. She told me she had been afraid to say something because she didn't want to damage our friendship. Then she admitted that somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love with me. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't feel the same. Because I did. I had simply been too afraid to name it. For years, I had told myself that what Clara and I shared was friendship, loyalty, family, and gratitude. But as I looked at her, I realized that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it grows through grocery bags, hospital visits, birthday cakes, difficult conversations, and ordinary afternoons. Sometimes it begins when 2 wounded people stop trying to rescue each other and simply decide to stand beside each other. I told Clara I loved her too. She cried. I did too. There was no grand proposal that day. No dramatic crowd. No perfect cinematic moment. There was simply honesty. And somehow, that was more beautiful. The following year, we married in a small outdoor ceremony surrounded by the people who had become our family. Grace walked between us holding both our hands. Adrian sat in the front row, smiling through tears. Everett and Mallory stood nearby, older and wiser now, their lives transformed by the consequences of one terrible joke. After the ceremony, Everett approached me. He had carried guilt about that restaurant for years. He told me that the day they invited Clara as a joke had become the day he finally understood how casually people could hurt someone when they believed they were only playing around. I told him that I still remembered. But I also told him that I no longer wanted that memory to be a weapon. I had forgiven him. Not because what he did was acceptable. Because forgiveness had given me freedom from having to carry the anger forever. Mallory hugged Clara and apologized once more. Clara accepted the apology, but she also told Mallory something she would never forget: forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to let the worst moment define the rest of someone's life. Years later, Grace would ask about the photograph from our wedding. She would point at herself as a little girl standing between Clara and me, then point at Adrian sitting nearby. She would ask why everyone looked so emotional. Clara would smile. She would tell Grace that sometimes families don't begin in ordinary ways. Sometimes families are built through unexpected friendships, difficult choices, forgiveness, and people deciding to stay when leaving would be easier. Grace would never know that her life had once been connected to a cruel joke. She would only know that she was loved. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Because the people at that restaurant thought they were creating an embarrassing afternoon. Instead, they unknowingly introduced two strangers who would become family. They thought a pregnant woman would be an easy target. Instead, she became the strongest person I knew. They thought humiliation would make me angry. Instead, it reminded me of my mother's final lesson. They thought forgiveness would make us weak. Instead, forgiveness allowed all of us to become stronger. And the greatest lesson I carried from that day was one I eventually shared with Grace when she was old enough to understand it: never laugh at someone's struggle simply because you don't understand it. Never assume you know what someone has survived. And never underestimate what one small act of kindness can become. Because the stranger sitting beside you might be carrying a story that could change your life. The person everyone else ignores might become the person who teaches you how to live. And the moment that feels like humiliation today might someday become the beginning of the most beautiful chapter of your life. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before you go, tell our community one thing in the comments: do you believe people truly deserve second chances when they prove they have changed? Your answer could give hope to someone struggling to forgive themselves or someone else. Because in the end, Clara wasn't the joke. Neither was I. The joke was the belief that kindness was weakness. The joke was the belief that someone's worst day defined them forever. The joke was believing that broken people couldn't build beautiful lives. And as I watched Grace running across the sunny park years later, laughing with her friends while Clara stood beside me and Adrian watched proudly from a nearby bench, I finally understood the truth my mother had tried to teach me all those years ago. You cannot control who hurts you. You cannot control who leaves. You cannot control the mistakes other people make. But you can control what their cruelty turns you into. And I chose not to become cruel. I chose kindness. I chose forgiveness. I chose hope. And somehow, that choice gave me a family I never knew I was looking for.